Hello and welcome to another edition of The Leading Question. I'm your host, Steve Wigreiser, and I am pleased to be back with you. And like you, we are emerging from the haze of COVID-19, hopefully getting out and about in the community in a safe way. And I hope you are vaccinated. If you're not, please make arrangements to do so as soon as possible. And you will see that that term has some relevance to today's show. One of the things that I'm looking forward to is getting back into the courtroom and protecting the rights and prosecuting claims of victims of negligence, whether it be individual negligence or corporate negligence, wrongdoing by a hospital or a doctor. So I'm looking forward to getting back into the courtroom and protecting your rights. The other thing that I'm looking forward to doing is bringing you quality programming here on The Leading Question. We want to bring you interesting and vital people who contribute to the community in a big way, and we're not going to let you down in that regard today, because I have with me one of the more interesting and talented attorneys that I've ever met in the city of Philadelphia. His name is Larry Cohan, and he has been a practicing lawyer for more than 40 years. He is a partner at the law firm of Saltz, Mongeluzzi, and Bendesky, and his practice areas are so diverse. I'm going to name a few, but I know I'm going to leave some of them out. One of them is toxic torts, and we're going to talk about what that means. Another one is mass torts, and a third is vaccine litigation. And that's above and beyond all of the other things that he does, which includes medical malpractice and transportation accidents of all kinds. So please join me in welcoming Larry Cohan. Larry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So before we get started, we need to define a few terms. One of them is toxic tort, and the other is mass tort. And keep in mind that when we're talking about torts, we are talking about a civil wrong other than a breach of contract, which more often than not involves a personal injury or a death. So if we connect two words, for example, toxic and tort, what does that mean?
It's a good question. I get asked that question by people and lawyers all the time. A toxic tort is a tort, as you've described it, that involves somebody being exposed to a chemical. So, for example, the original oldest toxic tort is asbestos. We know that asbestos is a chemical. It's actually a mineral. It's mined. People breathe it in, and that chemical, asbestos, causes an injury to the person. That individual has a toxic tort claim. And that has become a very specialized area for the practice of law, and one that I've been engaged in for over 40 years. And I'm sure we'll get into it. Toxic torts involve many chemicals, many injuries, signature injuries that relate to specific chemical exposures.
Is there a signature injury associated with asbestos that is part of the cases that you handle that our viewers should know about?
Asbestos, which is mined from the ground, is then woven into products of all types. Almost every building, every facility built in America in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s has asbestos-containing products. The fibers get inhaled into the lung begins to scar, and the signature injury that is unfortunately, tragically fatal is mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a type of cancer that occurs in the lining of the lung, and unfortunately most folks within a year of a diagnosis are lost. Before you get there, you can develop something called asbestosis, which is when those fibers in the lung cause scarring, and that scarring diminishes the ability to breathe. So people get shortness of breath, they get other related problems, and ultimately it can evolve into mesothelioma.
So asbestos exposure may be one type of toxic tort and is a type of case that you would handle.
Correct.
Now, we use the term mass torts.
Yep.
What does that mean?
So a mass tort is some situation where so many people across the country have a similar exposure, a similar problem related to a pharmaceutical, a medical device, it could be a chemical, and it becomes so massive that the courts have to figure out a way to deal with it. And what they do is they consolidate it into one courthouse, one judge, and they take all the cases from all over the country and put them in front of one judge. It's called multi-district litigation. And it can be done in a state court as well. They can consolidate in front of one judge, and that is then called a mass tort. So it's a tort, injuries to individuals. It's so massive that in order to manage it, the courts have decided, let's have one judge. We only have to take the witnesses' depositions one time. We only have to obtain the corporate documents and the discovery one time. And then that court will supervise the trials and ultimately the disposition of the cases. So for example, the one that most folks will know about because it's been on TV, Roundup. Roundup is a chemical. There's actually a chemical in Roundup, which is the product we use as a weed killer. People who breathe that in or who get exposed to it on their skin can develop non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There were literally thousands of cases, individual toxic tort cases, being filed all around the country for those folks who got that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And there were so many that the courts were burdened, they consolidated the cases into a major federal court mass tort program. They also had a second state court mass tort program. And people may have read that that mass tort was just settled recently for $10 billion, and over 100,000 people involved in that mass tort are being compensated now.
So it sounds like a more efficient way to bring and to prosecute the litigation than pursuing it in many different jurisdictions at the same time.
Exactly. It saves a lot of time, a lot of money for the courts, the lawyers, and the victims. Imagine one victim of Roundup exposure trying to prove that Monsanto, or Bayer, who bought Monsanto, did something wrong and that their wrong led to their injury. That one individual could never afford to do that. One lawyer, one small team of lawyers, would be fighting a war for years. When you consolidate the cases, the victims often get a better shake. And the companies have a much more formidable opponent because they're facing a team of lawyers, a large national team of lawyers.
So there's another term that I think is frequently confused with mass torts, and that is class actions. So what is the difference between a class action and a mass tort?
Another good question. Not only do clients and other folks ask me that, but lawyers ask me that all the time. A class action is when you file a single lawsuit and you file it with a lead plaintiff, a lead victim, and you're saying, we want to represent an unidentified, unknown group of people, maybe in the state, maybe nationwide, that we believe may have suffered the same harm as this one lead plaintiff. And we're going to litigate that claim, and we're going to find out who all those people are and bring them under this umbrella of this class. It's another approach to resolving a big problem.
And the third area that I want to talk about today, and one that couldn't be more timely, is vaccine litigation. And this is something that has been a topic of discussion among lawyers, just as the topic of vaccines is obviously in the news and is the topic of a great deal of social conversation. As I think about it, in the last few months, not only did I have my 2 Pfizer COVID-19 vaccines. I got my flu vaccine. Recently, I got my pneumovax or pneumococcal pneumonia vaccine, and I'm going to get a shingles vaccine. So every time that I get a vaccine, I don't worry so much about having a sore arm, but I worry about what would happen if, for some reason, maybe particular to me, or for some reason particular to the vaccine, I became ill or I suffered an injury. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Steve, that's the question that's on everybody's mind today with what's going on with COVID. But this is a question that has been addressed for decades. Should we get vaccines? Is there a risk associated with getting a vaccine? And if you face that risk, do you have any legal rights? It's a fairly complex legal field. And my work in toxic torts decades ago led me to some clients who believed they had chemical exposures, but in fact they were reacting to a vaccine. And I got into vaccine litigation well over 30 years ago. In essence, a vaccine can cause harm to a person. And I want to make something very clear before we get into any more detail here. I am in favor of vaccines. You would be a very good patient or a client because you get your vaccines. Everybody should. Whatever your doctor recommends, you should get it. And I want to make this clear. The risks associated with vaccines, all of the recommended vaccines, are a minuscule, tiny fraction of the potential of the benefits. So that 1 in 1 million people actually have an adverse reaction of magnitude to a regular vaccine, whereas vaccines save millions of lives. So we get our vaccines. Then what happens if you are one of those 1 in a million? We know that the flu vaccine, for example, and I want to make this clear to my friends who might be anti-vaxxers. The fact that 1 in a million people can develop Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a central nervous system disorder, as a very rare reaction to a vaccine, doesn't mean that the rest of our society shouldn't be getting their flu vaccines. Because 60,000 people a year die from the flu. And literally, you might have a couple dozen out of a 300 million population that develop a reaction to the vaccine.
A risk-benefit analysis compels you to get the vaccine, as I did, as I'm sure you did, and I hope all of our viewers will do. So, okay, so let's say somebody or a family member, friend, loved one gets a vaccine and becomes ill. What kind of illnesses are we talking about here?
So it's a phenomenon that science is now beginning to understand. When I began to do this litigation, the medical community was in denial. They believed that vaccines couldn't cause harm. We had a difficult time proving our case. But the science and the medicine have evolved. We now understand how the immune system works. Scientists can monitor it. That's why we were able to develop the COVID vaccine so quickly, because we now know what we need to do to get the immune system to learn and react to an insult. The problem is that a rare individual gets a vaccine. The vaccine has an irritant, both the offending agent, the flu, and it has an adjuvant, something to stir up the immune system. And they use things like aluminum to irritate the body. It's a very gentle, microscopic irritation, enough to get the immune system going. And the immune system fires at the offending agent, kills it, learns to recognize it, so if that flu or COVID ever enters your body again, you can fight it off. Every now and then, the body's immune system misfires. And instead of hitting the offending agent, it hits the body itself. It can hit the central nervous system. It can cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, something called chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, which is an injury to the spinal cord, and it begins to fail.
Sounds like a pretty severe injury.
It is.
Yeah.
It can cause conditions like ADEM. It can hit the brain. It can hit muscle tissue. It can cause transverse myelitis, which is another injury to the spinal cord. It can do a lot of, it can cause blood disorders. Anything that the body misfires, where the body misfires and hits another part of the body, can be damaged. Very rare.
Is there a typical amount of time within which, if somebody's going to have this idiopathic reaction to a vaccine, that the reaction is going to occur? Some time period that our viewers can know about.
Yes, and this also is something that has evolved in recent science and medicine and research. They've studied enough people that have had reactions to vaccines, but they now know how long it takes for a vaccine to get the body worked up and to have that reaction begin, and they know how long it takes for the vaccine essentially to be out of the body. And believe it or not, it's pretty definitive, 3 to 42 days. So 3 days after your vaccination is the shortest time that your body will be able to have a reaction. And about 6 weeks, that vaccine is gone. And by the way, it's the same medicine and science that has led us to understand now that it takes 2 weeks for that second COVID shot to take effect. Probably after 3 or 4 weeks, you're even better off. But in 2 weeks, the vaccine is working its way out of your system and your body's reaction has been completed.
Okay, so we have a time period to work with. So if one of our viewers or a family member or friend experiences a bad reaction within that window, what should they do?
First, obviously, go to their doctor, report it. If your doctor tells you it can't have anything to do with the vaccine, either go to another doctor or be more persuasive, because it can. And a lot of doctors will be in denial. But there is something called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, the VAERS system in the federal government. When a doctor is told by a patient that they believe they had a reaction to a vaccine, they're supposed to fill out this form, file it with the CDC, and then we know, the government knows, and they can track adverse reactions. After you've dealt with your doctor, then you can go see a lawyer. And I will tell you that most lawyers will not know what to do with your claim. Many will not recognize that there is a claim. The vaccine law is rather obscure, and we can get into this because it's fascinating.
Well, let's do this. Let's get what I used to call the Reader's Digest version.
Yep.
Give us an idea. I know you handle the claims. Where do you file them? What period of time might it take to get a disposition? And what are the odds of success in one of these types of claims?
Something that most lawyers don't even know is that there is a vaccine court that sits down in Washington, D.C. There are 8 judges that do nothing but hear vaccine cases full-time. There is a fund that has $4.5 billion in it. Those dollars are earmarked for nothing other than to compensate victims of vaccines. Most folks don't know this. Every time you get a vaccine and you pay your doctor $50, 75 cents goes into that fund. And that fund keeps growing and growing. It pays out several $100 million a year, but the revenue and the return on the investment is growing faster than the payouts. It's a gigantic fund. It's readily available. When you file your claim, you have to comply with the Federal Claims Court Vaccine Court rules. There's a list of all the vaccines and all the injuries that they recognize, and you can argue even beyond that list. You file your claim. There's a statute of limitations, 3 years, unless it's a death case, which can happen, which is 2 years. There's no tolling for minors. There's no forgiveness or discovery later on. It's a very hard and fast rule. 2 years or 3 from the date of vaccination. It's like any other court. Depending on the complexity of your case, how much it's defended, it could go anywhere from 1.5 years to 4 or 5 years.
And ultimately, will it be the judge that decides the amount of compensation, or is there a schedule of compensation? How does that work?
It's a fascinating program. The cases are defended by the Department of Justice. Lawyers that are employed by the government, DOJ lawyers, defend the cases. And the HHS Department, Health and Human Services, has a team of doctors, lawyers, and adjusters who administer the fund I just described. They make the determinations on whether they will voluntarily pay out or not. If they decide that they want to fight the claim, then you go to trial, and these are bench trials, trials in front of the vaccine judges. We call them special masters, but they're just like judges. And you go to trial down in Washington, and after the trial, they render a decision. They decide whether there is entitlement, meaning causation, and they decide how much the victim should get. And there's a cap of $250,000 on pain and suffering. There's an unlimited amount that can be awarded for medical bills, past and future, life care needs, and economic losses.
And I'm assuming that over the years you've handled dozens and dozens of these cases.
Hundreds, and many I have tried in Washington. We've made new law. We've managed to prove that victims have had an adverse reaction to a specific vaccine. We have tremendous doctors that we work with that really go out on a limb, because the medical community wants people to get their vaccines. They don't want to support a proposition that suggests that vaccines can cause harm. But the one thing I didn't say yet is, why did they set up this vaccine court? They set it up to encourage people to keep getting their vaccines. The vaccine manufacturers and the doctors are not involved in this program. They do not defend these claims. The manufacturers and the doctors are essentially immune from suit.
I see.
The fund pays the victim.
Can somebody who is a victim of a serious adverse reaction from a vaccine file a lawsuit in the Court of Common Pleas of Philadelphia or in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania?
You cannot. In fact, there's a Supreme Court of the United States decision just a couple years ago that came down and said the vaccine court has exclusive jurisdiction. And you really, if you don't file there, you may have a problem. The courts in the states and even the federal courts don't have jurisdiction over these claims.
Recently, we've heard stories about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the potential for the development of blood clots. If an individual has their COVID-19 vaccine and develops an adverse reaction to it, are they eligible for compensation in the vaccine courts?
It's a good, current, and difficult question. And unfortunately, the simple answer to that is no. We're hoping that these blood clot cases are rare and that this is not a pattern that begins to repeat itself in any significant numbers. We don't want people to be discouraged from getting vaccinations. However, the government anticipated a potential risk, and just under a year ago, Congress quietly passed a bill providing 100% immunity to vaccine manufacturers, doctors, pharmacists, administrators of vaccines, distributors of all kinds. There is no liability of any kind. The vaccine program I described in Washington, for now, does not have jurisdiction over the COVID vaccine. So those folks have one recourse only. There is a federal emergency fund. Anybody who wants to reach out, I can give them the information, that will provide medical expenses, that medical expenses can be covered. They will not provide anything for pain and suffering. They don't pay lawyers' fees. They will only pay for medical bills.
Is there a chance that the COVID vaccines will become listed and therefore compensable vaccines in the future?
We are hoping that that happens. Myself, the other groups that I work with in the world of vaccine litigation, the American Association for Justice, where I chair the vaccine litigation group nationally, we are advocating, we are lobbying Congress to try to get that law changed so that the COVID vaccine does become part of the program in Washington, D.C., so that if there are unfortunate people who have a reaction, they can get meaningful compensation. I'm hoping that happens in the future.
Give us some examples of the toxic tort cases you're working on, the mass tort cases you're working on, so that our viewers can have an idea where they should go if their claims fall within any one of those categories.
I've already mentioned mesothelioma. Now that is really treated more like an individual toxic tort. Although there is an MDL, the federal national coordination hasn't worked out. They really have had those cases individually tried as individual toxic tort cases around the country. Roundup, which is a toxic tort case, has become a mass tort, and it's been resolved effectively. One of the newer ones that people may have read about or heard about is talc. Johnson & Johnson's baby powder has talc in it. Talc has some metal, and it also has asbestos fibers. They're not intended to be there, but when you mine talc, you get asbestos. Talc can lead to ovarian cancer. So it's a toxic tort that has now been consolidated and has become a mass tort. And the poor women who have ovarian cancer, they have claims in this mass tort. One of the newest ones that we've just gotten involved with is paraquat.
What is paraquat?
Paraquat is an herbicide. It's used by farmers, growers all over the country to kill, obviously, offending agents in their farms and their gardens. It's not a backyard product. It's more of an industrial product. It causes Parkinson's disease. And we have now filed individual toxic tort cases for those folks that have Parkinson's who work with paraquat. If there's enough filings, it may become a mass tort.
So you're on the leading edge of this type of litigation.
Yes. I'll give you one more example, Steve. And for the folks who live in this region, they may know about up in Bucks and Montgomery counties, right here in Pennsylvania. There were 2 military bases where they used a firefighting foam. That foam had a chemical in it called PFAS, and it's a perfluorinated chemical. It's indestructible, non-biodegradable. It hits the ground after they use it to try to put fires out. They only use it mostly for practice on the military bases. Goes in the ground, gets into the groundwater, people drink it. It's highly toxic. It causes cancers, causes big problems. And our 4 water authorities up in Bucks and Montgomery counties, the governmental entities that sell the water to the communities and distribute it, have had to shut the water down for well over 100,000 homes, right here in our neck of the woods.
Yeah.
They're piping the water in from another region because of this chemical. It's now involved in, it was an individual case, chemical exposure, PFAS chemical exposure. It's now become a mass tort because it's grown around the country.
And it sounds like that expense may be passed on to the taxpayers unless appropriate steps are taken with respect to the manufacturer.
The companies who manufactured and sold those PFAS chemicals for decades, knowing that the products were potentially deadly, they have to be held accountable.
And on that note, I'm sorry to say that we're out of time. And it's a shame because we're just scratching the surface. And Larry, I have to tell you, sometimes I'm not sure whether I'm talking to a lawyer or a scientist. You have such a command of the substance of these cases, and I know you are passionate about them, and I know you are dedicated to your clients. And on behalf of all Philadelphians, I want you to know that we thank you and we appreciate that. And that will do it for this edition of The Leading Question.